Hello, everyone. My name is Joe. I am an undergrad in UCLA studying mass of computation. Last summer, I worked as a researcher in Sperax. Sperax is a blockchain company located in Silicon Valley and focused on building the next generation of the global financial infrastructure. Today, I'm very happy to be the presenter of our latest paper in Sperax. Sperax, a approach to defeat long-range attacks in blockchains. My presentation today will consist of 4 parts. In the first part, I will briefly go over what is a long-range attack in blockchain and why we should care. And then in the second and third part, I will introduce the solution provided by Sperax POR consensus. In the end, I will show how our POR consensus defeats long-range attacks. Probably, as everyone will agree, currently there's a trend in blockchain industry of moving from proof-of-work consensus to proof-of-stake consensus. However, there is an inherent problem now of a POS consensus protocol. That is, for POS consensus, it is generally costless to produce a new block. And this leads to what we call long-range attacks. A long-range attack, in short, is a special kind of double spending. Let me show you a typical long-range attack by an example. We say Bob once owned a lot of coins in some POS blockchain. And due to his huge stake, was chosen to produce the next block of the green block here. However, nowadays, Bob has already cashed out all his money from the blockchain. That is, at the last block of the main chain, Bob has already spent every coin of his. Moreover, Bob is vicious and decides to launch a long-range attack to double spend. So what will he do? First, he will go all the way back to the green block. Then, since he always has the right to produce the block after the green block, now he will produce another block in parallel to the one he once produced, and thus make a fork chain from the green block. Next, he extends his fork chain efficiently so that his fork chain replaces the main chain. Lastly, when Bob's fork chain replaces the main chain, we can see here the upper chain is longer than the lower chain. At this time, he once again owns a lot of money in the blockchain and can double spend. In this way, Bob successfully carried out a long-range attack. And obviously, it is a huge problem. So how can POS consensus blockchains defeat this problem? Here in Sperax, we provide a solution. It is a new POS consensus protocol named Proof of Authenticated Randomness, or simply POR consensus. Since it is based on tamper-proof hardware owned by each node in the network, I will first introduce this hardware and then the POR consensus protocol itself. In our Proof of Authenticated Randomness consensus, or POR consensus, each node is required to has a Sperax authenticated hardware. Each hardware is unique to each user. So in other words, a user or a node can be identified by its hardware and vice versa. Also, the hardware is tamper-proof. If a hardware detects any attempt to tamper its data, the hardware will protect itself by zeroizing all of its data and reporting to Sperax Foundation. Here we require our hardware to at least meet the Federal Information Processing Standard shown here. Most importantly, the hardware has 2 functionalities. The first functionality is a RNG, or random number generator. Whenever the user input a round number R and a step number S, the hardware will produce a random number along with some certification that shows the output random number is in fact produced by the specific hardware with these two specific input numbers. The second functionality of this hardware is a block height counter or round counter. When the user inputs a sequence of round numbers, say here R0, R1, all the way to RA, notice that these round numbers do not need to be consecutive, but they do need to be in order, and R0 must be the current count held by the hardware. So given this sequence of input, the hardware will output a hash value of this sequence along with some certification message. Meanwhile, significantly, besides producing output, the hardware will update its counter, in this case, from its previous value R0 to RA-1. Okay, now after introducing the hardware, I will explain POR consensus itself. At a very, very high level, a POR consensus blockchain is a sequence of blockchain system states whose transition from the current state to the next one is empowered by transaction blocks. For example, our blockchain system is currently in S0 system state. Then it moves from S0 to S1 by a block of transaction called TX1. Then it moves from S1 to S2 by another transaction block, TX2, so on and so on. Now, the biggest question is how a POR blockchain generates its transaction blocks and keeps the system state moving forward, right? Essentially, it is the same question as how a POR blockchain system proposes candidate blocks and finalize a single block out of them and thus generate a block. Basically, in order for the blockchain to generate a new block, there are three phases. First, the system in a decentralized way selects block proposers, or we call potential leaders. Every potential leader will produce and broadcast a candidate block. Second, the system, again in a decentralized way, selects a verifier committee. Every verifier will vote for one block among all the blocks she has received from potential leaders and will then broadcast her vote. Lastly, the system, again in a decentralized way, will finalize one single block from all proposed blocks based on the votes each of them has received. This is a very brief summary. Now we will dive into some important details of these three phases. First phase, the question we want to ask is how potential leaders are selected in a decentralized way. I will explain it by an example. So say Alice has 7 coins in her account. Then during the potential leader selection, each of her 7 coins will be treated as one individual chance. In other words, because Alice have 7 coins, she has 7 chances to be chosen. The probability of each individual chance is P, which is a system parameter. The rule is that if any of Alice's 7 coins is chosen, then Alice, the user, is chosen as a potential leader. And this is the mass expression of this process. Basically, each user will input a bunch of numbers into her hardware. Then the RNG, or random number generator functionality of the hardware, will output a random number, which determines the result. Second phase. Now the question we want to ask is how verifiers are selected in, again, a decentralized way. Again, I will explain it by an example. Say Charlie has 4 coins in his account. Then similarly to the first phase, each of his coin will be treated as one chance of being chosen. So since Charlie has 4 coins, he has 4 chances to be chosen as a verifier. The probability here is P prime, which is also a system parameter. But the rule is different. The rule here is that the number of coins chosen is the number of votes Charlie will have. So for example, if 2 of Charlie's 4 coins are chosen, then Charlie simply has 2 votes. And this is the mass expression of this process. Again, it makes use of the RNG functionality of the hardware. Third and the last phase. Now that we already have all potential leaders and they propose a bunch of candidate blocks, and we also have all verifiers who like each vote for their favorite block. The last question remains when a ordinary node in the blockchain network receives all the above messages, how can she decide which block is the block chosen by the whole network? In fact, it is very straightforward. For example, some ordinary Joe, he has received a lot of messages from potential leaders and verifiers. What will he do? He simply first check if there is a candidate block, B, which receives over 2/3 of all votes. If there is such block, then he accepts it as the final block chosen by the whole network. If there is no such block, then he simply finalizes an empty block as the block of this round. Oh, cool. Now we have already introduced and explained our hardware-based POR consensus. The last, but the most significant question to answer is, how does a POR consensus defeat long-range attacks? The secret weapon POR consensus uses to defeat long-range attacks is hidden in the tamper-proof hardware. You might notice that throughout the whole block generation process I just explained in the previous part, we only mention the RNG functionality of the hardware without even a single word on its run counter functionality. This run counter functionality is the secret weapon. The run counter functionality has 3 important rules. First, the input, that is a sequence of round numbers, has to contain at least 2 round numbers. Second, R0, that is the first round number in the input sequence, has to be the count currently held by the counter. Lastly, the hardware will refuse any input if any of the round number in the input sequence is less than the count it holds. POR consensus defeats long-range attacks by a mechanism I call transaction certification. In an ordinary POS consensus, a transaction is finalized simply when the block containing this transaction is finalized. In our POR consensus, however, for a transaction to be finalized, it needs to meet an additional requirement. The transaction needs to be certified. How will a transaction be certified? It is pretty simple. Suppose a user PI wants to certify one of her transactions TX, which is contained in some block BR. Also, suppose that the last certified transaction of her is TX prime and is contained in some block BR prime. To certify TX, first he input the round number R prime and then R into her hardware. Then when the hardware output a pair of messages, she broadcasts it to the whole blockchain network. Lastly, when her certification message is included in some block, and that block is finalized, her transaction TX is then certified. Now I claim with transaction certification, POR consensus will defeat long-range attacks. Let me show this by the same example I have used when introducing long-range attacks at the beginning of my presentation. Recall that we have Bob, who once owned a lot of coins, has already spent every coin of his nowadays, and decides to viciously carry out a long-range attack. So he goes back to some previous block we call big green, makes a fork chain from there, and extends his fork chain efficiently so that it replaces the main chain. However, when Bob attempts to double spend on his fork chain, he are required to certify the transaction that carries out his double spend. Unfortunately, he cannot, because to certify this transaction, he has to first input a round number that is less or equal to the round number of big green. However, since Bob already spent all his coins in the main chain, the count in his hardware has already been set far larger than the round number of big green. So since the first round number he input, that is the round number of big green, is far less than the count in his hardware, his request to certify his double spending transaction will always be refused by his hardware. In this way, the vicious Bob is ruined by our POR consensus. All right, to wrap things up, I first introduced an inherent problem of POS blockchain called long-range attacks. Then I introduced and explained our hardware-based POR consensus and its transaction certification mechanism. Lastly, I showed how our POR consensus defeats long-range attacks. I hope you find my presentation enjoyable and hopefully inspiring. Thank you for your time.